After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper, and a sardius stone in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne, in appearance like an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal. And in the midst of the throne, and around the throne, were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within. And they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne, and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. This is the word of the Lord. A reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 4. Welcome to Christian Spirituality Chapters in the History of the Faith. I am your host, Professor Matthew Hoskin, Professor of Christian History at Davenant Hall. In this podcast, I take you in a largely chronological journey through the history of Christianity, but approaching things from the angle of what we might call spirituality, or the spiritual life. And this week, I am talking about worship in the early church, or indeed early Christian worship. I was actually going to restrict it to one aspect of how the ancient church looked at things, which would be the question of idolatry, which is actually a naturally arising question after last episode, or chapter, as I like to call them, about Tertullian. But I realized this was more pressing to do, because at this time, as I have plugged recently, I am preparing to teach a course for Davenant Hall all about early Christian worship, ritual and space in the ancient church. And so I thought I would take an opportunity to give you some idea of what this course is going to be about, and also whether you sign up for the course or not, of course, to find something edifying and interesting here on the podcast. So that is sort of what I'm going to be doing today. And that passage from Revelation came to me for 2 reasons, quite frankly. One of them is a friend of mine who is a pastor and missionary director for an American church denomination, once was preaching about worship. And, we're there in this sort of, at the time, I was worshiping with him at a non-denominational church in another part of the world. And he was saying that, hey, when we look at the book of Revelation, we have all these sorts of ideas of the way we normally look at it. But when he looks at the book of Revelation, he starts to realize just how much of it is in fact about worship. The worship that is being given to God, or the worship that we ought to be given to God. And what does the worship in heaven look like? And the worship in heaven, actually, he said, and this was in an Orthodox country, to sort of non-denominational evangelical types, that in fact, the worship in heaven looks quite liturgical, much to our chagrin back then. Now, I myself am an Anglican, which means that I find these sorts of questions enduringly fascinating. And the other reason I wanted to start this episode with that passage from the book of Revelation is because I am deeply enamored with late antique and medieval mosaics. And I love the beautiful basilicas of the city of Rome. And in Rome, one of the very nicest, if not one of the most famous, it is not one of the most famous of these basilicas, is the Basilica of Santa Prassede, built by Pope Pascal I in the 9th century. The current structure and much of its decoration date from Pascal I in the 800s. So we're thinking Carolingian popes. And it is extraordinary. You should Google right now what is going on the triumphal arch in this church and all the sorts of different things you see. And this is not the only church that has some of these motifs. And here on this church, when you are worshiping in the congregation, standing, kneeling, not a lot of sitting in the medieval church, and you're looking at this huge archway before the chancel or the apse area, the mosaic represents the 24 elders of Revelation before Christ on the rainbow throne. And many other similar mosaics depict the Lamb from the book of Revelation being worshipped. And sometimes the Lamb with the 4 rivers of paradise flowing out from the base of his feet. And in another church in Rome, Santi Cosma ai Damiano, which is right on the Forum, you can see 6th century mosaics. So these are super early, from the time of Felix V. And there in the center of this one, it is Christ sort of in these rainbow clouds, and it's extraordinarily beautiful. These are amazing mosaics. They're a style that you might call Byzantine, which esteemed scholar John Osborne goes for that term, but equally esteemed scholar, albeit not of art, Rosamund McKitterick, pushes back against him for that usage. Both of them are wonderful human beings who I really like, and also extraordinarily intelligent, and definitely better at that angle of history than I am. Anyway, apologies to those who are listening for the pauses. I'll be drinking water. I'm a little bit losing my voice. Anyway, so I was thinking of those and what it means to usher into a space of worship adorned with a mosaic, and that depicts the heavenly worship. And that is, of course, one of the points of Christian worship at large throughout the entirety of the history of the Christian faith, is that this is the point where heaven and earth meet, right? This is the intersection point of the heavenly and the earthly, is in the assembly of the saints, the ekklesia. And this is where it occurs, and it occurs most potently, as many people will argue, in the Eucharist, in the bread and the wine, the body and blood of Christ himself, who is now reigning on high, having ascended to the Father. And so you come into a church and you're participating in that. And this leads inevitably to the famous anecdote about the emissaries who are sort of been sent out from the Kievan Rus, the to the Viking kingdom that eventually becomes sort of Russia, Ukraine, and all of that sort of thing. And they come back to report on the religion, and they say that the religion of Byzantium was such that they did not know whether they were on heaven or on earth. And for me personally, the space that most evokes a feeling of otherworldliness and a feeling of transcendence, just simply in terms of space, is in fact La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which is this amazing rayonnant Gothic space filled almost entirely with, in fact, these windows with this beautiful purple hue that sort of imbues everything with its light. And these extraordinarily thin, slender, beautiful columns that rise up before spreading out into the vault. And of course, that's the point of rayonnant, right? And then the entire point of Gothic, in fact, is that the light, which is itself an earthly, natural symbol for the light of Christ, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, can penetrate you through the biggest windows possible, right? If you read Abbot Suger, who invented it at Saint-Denis, that's the point of Gothic. And so these sorts of things are always running through our minds, my mind, maybe not yours. And what I'm going to be getting at in my course, though, I'm obviously not going to spend a lot of time talking about those questions, but the theological realities that early medieval mosaics, high medieval Gothic, and these anecdotes from sort of early medieval Byzantine and Rus, what these are driving at is a reality, I would argue, that the earliest Christians themselves lived. A reality that the earliest Christians themselves penetrated. A heavenly participation in the heavenly banquet. Meeting with God. And their spaces were inevitably different when the ekklesia of the saints gathers together in the workshop of a tradesman. This is not the same thing as gathering together in La Sainte-Chapelle or gathering together for choral evensong in Westminster Abbey, to list another thing I've done. Another place where I have felt the transcendence of God arise, or the music ringing out in the dome of St. Paul's in London. And yet it is the same heavenly reality that penetrates through their actions and gathers them up into the life of God and the life of Christ. And that's a theological statement, but it's a theological statement that I would say you can find more and more clearly articulated as time goes on, but I don't believe not present in Scripture. I believe it is there in Scripture. It is there in the early church centuries of the church, and it is part of what drives some of these questions that I want to address in this course. Because this course isn't just going to be a history of early Christian worship. It's going to be that, but there are lots of books about that you could read, or I'm sure other people have done their own sort of somewhere out there internet series. Who knows? I don't know about that. I do know, though, that the one thing when I kept on thinking about what is the angle that we really need to start getting our minds around is this question of space. Because we've got pretty good, in academia at least, in terms of thinking about the body and the embodiment of everything that we do as human beings, right? This embodied reality is what lies at the heart of all of the spiritual disciplines that we discuss on this podcast. And there's actually a great philosophy of that in the work of Dallas Willard. In his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines. I will put The Spirit of the Disciplines in the show notes so you can look it up later. And this reality of our embodied existence isn't just this body, this fleshiness of my hands hitting together, this fleshiness here. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. No. God has given us this too solid flesh. This always exists in time and relative dimension in space. And so, where are we when we're doing these ritual actions? Where are we when we are reciting the creed? What direction are we facing? Why do we face east to pray traditionally? Why do Christians, historically, Eastern Christians still do this, get down on their hands and knees and press their foreheads to the ground? And why do we choose to do this in some places more than in others? And why do we think that perhaps having a silent disco in a church is inappropriate? That the sanctuary of a church should be reserved, sort of like as, according to little St. Benedict, the oratory of a monastery ought to be reserved for nothing but prayer. Right? Why do we have these thoughts, and how do these thoughts emerge over time? These are the sorts of things I want to get into. But also, what did they worship in? Just in terms of, like, setting aside the theological, what were their churches actually? And how do these match onto the liturgical sources that we have? And how can we start to actually imagine what's going on? You know, what sort of space, when Justin Martyr gives that description that I gave in an earlier episode of this podcast, well, what on earth kind of church is that? What kind of space are the Christians gathering in? Where is the ekklesia meeting when they have that church service that looks an awful lot like a traditional liturgy? At least in terms of its bare bones outline, right? So where are they meeting? And this, of course, arises all sorts of questions, like, so we have these archaeological things for early on. Then we have Dura Europos and the baptistry that survives there. And so what does that mean? And how does that interact with sort of the Jewish synagogue that's like on the same street as it, right? So we're in 3rd century Syria. Dura Europos is this amazing abandoned city between the wars between Rome and Persia, where eventually it's nobody's in the end. The Romans just abandon it. And what is going on in the catacombs? I can tell you what is not people. People don't live there. Everybody who stays in the catacombs is already dead. But what are Christians doing when they go down to the catacombs? Are there actual churches there before the sort of Constantinian era, when people like Pope, well, he's post-Constantine, Pope Damasus, so people before the 380s? Are they actually having church services down there? Or how do you classify if there are gatherings of Christians, how does what goes on in the catacombs differ from what goes on a Sunday morning? And how does what goes on in the catacombs differ from what goes on with the pagan ekklesia, who also share some of these catacomb spaces, who will also possibly be having some of these sort of banquets for the dead and these sorts of things? So what's going on? What is the deal with the catacombs? The catacombs are fascinating. I love talking about them. The art is beautiful and striking and is important evidence for some basic practices. So we're going to be looking at the catacombs and Dior Europos, but we're going to be looking as well at sort of these basilicas that emerge. What does it mean in the era after Constantine when we start getting these actual buildings survive? Because, of course, they do a good job at destroying them under Diocletian and Galerius. What happens? What does it mean that this is the style of building that they choose? It doesn't look like the temple in Jerusalem. It doesn't look like a pagan temple. It's something new. Why do they choose? It's not something new. Religious speaking, it's something new, but it's an old kind of building. And then we're going to look at actually the concrete existing basilicas as well as a lot of the art that survives. Frequently, the city of Rome is the place to turn to because stuff tends to survive from Rome. But not only Rome, the Holy Land, you'll also have an opportunity. Because what happens to Christian worship in the era of the peace of the church, the triumph of Christianity, the reign of Constantine and beyond, sort of like life after 312, right, we start getting things like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Church of the Holy Nativity, the Church of the Oak at the Oak at Mamre, where God appeared to Abraham in the Three Visitors, as represented in Andrei Rublev's beautiful, magnificent, striking, penetrating into the heart icon that I absolutely love. What then? How does that, the emergence of pilgrimage, how does that influence Christianity? And of course, from that region, we start getting some of our early 4th century descriptions of a lot of sort of what we sort of think of as standard liturgy is coming out of there. So we're going to spend some time looking at those spots as well. So that's sort of what this course in sort of a big broad way is going to be. It's going to be looking at actual liturgical texts. What are all these things that we think of as worship, cultus, latreia, all of these questions, personal prayer, communal prayer, Holy Communion, Holy Baptism. Where do these things fit onto the spectrum? And we're going to look at a bunch of texts. We're going to look at things like 1 Corinthians, the Didache, Pliny the Younger, Justin's First Apology, early liturgies from the Ante-Nicene Fathers, volume number 7, questioning how early are those actually. The Hymn Phos Hilaron. We're going to read the entire book that modern scholars call the Apostolic Tradition and attribute to Hippolytus, and figure out, just see that whole thing and look at it, because it has some really great liturgical texts and shows a lot of other aspects of what could be deemed the worshiping life and liturgical life of the church. Also going to see Tertullian on prayer, which I talked about last episode here. Cyprian on the Lord's Prayer, which is part of the same modern translation anthology. And then from there, it's going to be Cyril of Jerusalem and Egeria's Travels together 1 week. More Cyril, then more Cyprian, because we're going to be looking at Eucharistic theology. And I think St. Cyprian of Carthage, I think, has some interesting things to say that I want to be investigating for sort of ante-Nicene Christianity. Although I also think St. Cyril of Alexandria has some really important things to say as well, but decided not to double up my Cyrils, but find someone else whose name begins with CY. Also bringing in the Latin tradition, right? Trying to be not so Greek all the time. And then we're going to be looking at the Didascalia, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And I was going to have us look at the apostolic constitutions, but I've decided not to, and I'm thinking of something else to look at that touches on this topic, simply because I think that one fairly sizable church order is enough, and you have two shorter ones in the Didache and the Didascalia as anyway. So I decided not to do the entirety of the apostolic constitution. So there's space in this course for some exciting other text. Reach out to me if you're like, hey, why didn't you do this, Dr. Hoskin? And maybe I'll include what you recommend. We're going to look at hymns as well, though. We're going to look at Ambrose. We're going to look at Ephraim. We're going to look at the hymn called the Te Deum Laudamus. And it's going to be amazing. I'm excited. I could do a whole course, actually, just on ancient hymnody, but I don't know if anyone would turn up. Then we're going to look at the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And we're going to look at various Latin liturgical bits and bobs. Latin liturgical texts tend to emerge, our evidence for them, I say, tends to be later, and so it's a bit of a different question than the ones in the Greek language. So maybe not as much Syriac as sometimes you might expect coming from me, but I think there's a good amount of stuff to be had for you to read there. And then we're going to be bringing these texts into dialogue, as I say, with archaeology and with art history and these buildings that still survive and their architecture and the embodied lives of Christians in the ancient world, primarily, of course, the ancient Mediterranean, and with an eye to seeing how they worshipped God, what their theology of this was, which means why they did what they did. And hopefully, let me tell you, I want to make sure you get your straight up history, no matter how uncomfortable it is, if you're an Anglican or if you're a Baptist or if you're a Roman Catholic or whatever. I just want to try to give you the straight up history. But I do, for this course, to be fully honest and fully clear, hope that wherever you come from into this course, your encounter with ancient Christianity and its modes of worship will empower you to become more reverent in your worship of God. And if you are involved in the leading of the ekklesia, of the assembly of the saints, you will be able to help your own congregation enter more deeply into the glory and reverence and love of God. That's something that I, as a lay reader in training in the Anglican Church of Canada, am looking forward to being able to do at the same time that I'm teaching this course. So it's actually kind of a really exciting thing for me to be able to doing both these things at the same time. So that's what this course is about. Through Davenant Hall, I'll be putting the link, of course, into the show notes, and I really do hope that some of you can sign up for it. Thanks for listening this long. Have yourself a great day.